Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 23rd of May, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. Got there in the end. Yes. Just in time delivery, I think. Where should we start? I think we better start on the serious matter of defence and the Defence Select Committee meeting yesterday, talking about Britain's relationship with NATO in particular, and the rabbit in the headlights here, Gavin Williamson. Just incredible, this event, Mike. We're going to have a look at what this gentleman had to say. I've called him the Pest Control Officer, Gavin Robinson, DUP, Belfast East, because he sat there very quietly and then he started to ask Gavin some questions. I wasn't quite sure where it was going. Let's have a look at that clip and see where it did lead to.
In terms of MDP then, how much engagement has there been outside of the sort of standard structure? So you'll have service-to-service engagement, you will have engagement fostered by and through NATO, you will have MOD to DOD engagement, but are we engaging with other political actors, say in Congress, with state governors, for example? Are they feeding into our MDP process?
So we have a broad range of interaction. I mean, this committee plays an important role in terms of dealing with and building relationships with the United States. When I was over in the US, it took the opportunity to see people who obviously have a strong defence interest, who serve in Congress and the Senate, and it's important to have that strength of relationship there. I think the strongest relationship will probably always be through the services, going back to the point of the fact that these are many men and women who have actually served together, and if you look at their current Defence Secretary, this is someone who has served alongside British officers in many different fields of conflict and puts an exceptionally high value on the skills, their capability and the leadership that they actually bring. So very strong relationship. Should we be doing more? I think we can.
I mean, very genuinely, are we engaging with members of the Defence Committee, the Armed Services Committee in Congress? Right. Are we talking to senators and congressmen about MDP and asking their view as to how our process should
So when I was over in the US, this was something that we discussed. One of the things that was actually discussed from the US side is how they'd fed into US defence strategy and a key role that they had played in terms of the development of US defence strategy. The key thing that came through in all the discussions I had was the value that they put on us as an indispensable ally, and the fact that we are consistently there. We are a nation that has always been willing to do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of relationship. If you look at the Gulf, if you look at the Mediterranean, if you look at the North Atlantic, if you look at NATO in general, they put a true value on that. Sure. But we certainly have engaged with them. But the main thrust of engagement has been through the Ministry of Defence and the Department of Defence in the United States. So that is where the bulk of our engagement has been.
I think I would like to get to a sense where we had an assessment of how much congressmen are engaged in our MDP process when we as a committee end up seeking to challenge and revise, but we're not shaping. We don't get the opportunity to shape, and further questions from Mr. Francois earlier about the rationale for seeking to double our presence in Afghanistan. For example, we can't engage in those discussions. So are elected representatives in the United States shaping our defence policy more than elected representatives here in the United Kingdom?
Oh, absolutely not, no. But it would be remiss of me not to take the opportunity to talk to people who've been involved in
Well, there we are. Very interesting to see that a lot of comment in our chat box where people picked up, firstly, that this man, Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, seemed utterly terrified in front of the cameras and the questioning. He didn't have any self-confidence. He didn't appear to say anything worthwhile, to the extent that a young lady top right in the screen was busy scratching and passing notes and grinning. She was clearly unimpressed. But the key part was towards the very end, where that very astute member for Belfast East said, well, you're having all these discussions with the Americans. You're talking to American Senate, you're talking to Congress, you're talking to senators, and they are shaping our defence policy. But the Defence Select Committee, we are not able to shape the policy itself. So that very astute question really drilling to the heart of it, that we have a secret cabal within the British government which is simply doing as it pleases with defence, and the Defence Select Committee doesn't understand what's actually happening. We can also ask the question, is it possible that Gavin Williamson can himself be setting the policy? And I think the answer to that on this video clip alone is that cannot be possible, because this man clearly doesn't have the self-confidence or the mental acumen to form the policy on anything. So while we reflect on that, let's just come back to a screenshot of that Defence Select Committee. And I found it interesting that sat next to the gentleman who was astute enough to ask the question. So on the left of your screen, that's Mr. Robinson from Belfast East. Sitting next to him is Johnny Mercer. And of course, Johnny Mercer spent some time in the army himself, but he admitted on the BBC a couple of weeks ago that he didn't really know what was going on in government. So we've got the situation, Mike, where we've got a defence minister who is saying that basically we've got carrier groups. Well, no, we haven't, Mr. Williamson, because we haven't got any carrier groups, because we haven't got any ships to put around the carriers. We haven't got any aircraft to put on those aircraft carriers. He talks about submarines in the North Atlantic working with the Americans. Well, we haven't got that capability either. Johnny Mercer says he's no idea what's going on. Well, maybe Johnny Mercer doesn't have any idea what's going on because he's spending too much time running with his comforter, Peppa Pig. I'm almost speechless, Mike, at this stage, because this is an immensely serious matter. We've got British troops deployed overseas, specifically the SAS and Special Forces deployed into Syria. No debate in Westminster. And now we've got the Defence Select Committee telling us very plainly that they have no idea what's going on either. So we've got what? A criminal cabal not only running the country, but able to deploy Britain's armed forces, or what's left of them, as they see fit. Immensely dangerous.
Absolutely. Now, this morning, Number 10 pushed this out. It was a tweet with this image, and it said, Prime Minister Theresa May and the Cabinet today, so that was yesterday, received Dementia Friends training, which highlighted the difficulties faced by people living with dementia, with key messages for helping them to lead better, happier lives. And I was inspired by this tweet, particularly this phrase at the end, because we have to think about having a better death. And apparently, if we've got dementia, we've got to think about having a better, happier life. And that phrase stuck in my head because it kind of, something just was, it rang a few bells. And this is the bell that it rang, in fact, because if we go back to early Soviet propaganda posters, here we have one from 1932, and the catchphrase on this poster is "Life has become better, life has become happier." And what we increasingly see, Brian, I believe, is our own government spewing out this Soviet-style propaganda at us, and it's about time they were called out for it.
Well, indeed, Mike, and we're going to cover again what's been happening in Iran and the backlash from the Iranians against British soft power. But let's remember that if we're talking about the Soviet system, where did the Soviet system actually come from? It came from developments out of the West, and in particular with the support of the Western banking interests. So could it be that the people that formed that a policy that effectively destroyed Russia at one stage have unleashed exactly the same policy within UK and Western Europe. I think it's perfectly possible.
Right. Antiwar.com and Justin Remindo have published this article, A Spy in the House of Trump, and they're highlighting a guy called Stefan Halper, who they're describing as a veteran dirty trickster, that he was outed. What they're saying, and what Justin Remindo was saying, is that Stefan Halper, being identified as a veteran British spy, had penetrated the Republican administration, three of them in fact, ultimately the Trump administration itself, and that Remindo says that the British never abandon a successful game plan. So this guy has been used time and time again through successive Republican administrations. And he says that in 2016, Halper, who's a dual citizen of the US and the UK, who has taught at Cambridge University, been a colleague of Sir Richard Dearlove, and that together with historian Peter Martland, that these three raised the alarm about Russian influence in the Trump administration and previous administrations. He said that Russiagate appeared to be launched by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele with the dirty dossier, but the problems with inaccurate details in the Steele dossier required a new myth to be created, which was that Trump had allegedly colluded with the Russians, and that this was said to have started when the Australian diplomat Alexander Downer, while he was drunk apparently, had a conversation with George Papadopoulos, who supposedly revealed that the Russians had thousands of Clinton campaign emails, and the Trump collusion that goes with that. And then it goes on to say that in September 2016, Halper requested a meeting with Papadopoulos to ask him to write a paper for a $3,000 fee and a trip to London. So he got $3,000 and a trip to London. They met a number of times, and Halper asked, George, you know about hacking the emails from Russia, right? And Papadopoulos had said he had no idea what Halper was talking about. And Halper at that meeting dropped the subject. And then he goes on to say that Halper had a history of disrupting campaigns. And he says that the Reagan-Carter 1980 presidential race, he had disseminated Carter's stolen foreign policy briefings to the media, and that he reportedly ran the operation that procured them in the first place. So he concludes that the Russiagate hoax has many actors, all playing their appointed roles as provocateurs, cutouts and informants, but this was originally a British production with Halper and Steele at the centre of it. The Obama leftovers in the FBI, the Justice Department and the CIA colluded with the British to frame the incoming president as a Russian agent. And he said the British in particular have never hesitated to interfere in US domestic politics if they thought their own interests would be advanced. It happened in the run-up to both world wars and is happening today. If we trace the origins of the Russiagate hoax and the campaign to dethrone Trump, all roads lead to London. Well, another article then, this is from Polizet, which republished by Zero Hedge, which, we've talked about Steele and the fact that he was involved in Orbis and so on, but this is a new company that they're talking about. I'm not really sure how it's pronounced, Hakluyt or Hakluyt, I'm not sure, and company, which was founded by three former MI6 operatives in 1995, and also played a role in the second part of Trumpgate, and the current staffing of this company, it's full of Hillary Clinton supporters and also people from the Obama administration in general, which is why Hillary's photograph's on there. So, and again, it links back to Stefan Halper, who was working for the Obama administration, also participating in the FBI and Department of Justice spy operation on the Trump campaign. So this two articles coming from slightly different angles, but which both together reinforce the idea that this seems to have been heavily, the whole situation with Trump, heavily motivated by British interests.
By British interests. We can call that the deep state power. So let's come back on to what's been happening with Iran and the arrest of so-called journalists. Now, we've spoken about this on a couple of days, but we're going to keep working on this because we can see more and more of these the pieces of the jigsaw coming to the surface. So Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe here, which we are labelling as victim of British BBC soft power subversion. And yesterday we showed this New York Times article going back some time where it was saying that the BBC are creating new initiatives under John Tusa, the then general manager of the BBC, creating what he called a Marshall Plan of the Mind, which would use radio to bring instructional broadcasts in history, banking, accounting and communication to the emerging democracies of Europe. So this gave us the model for the BBC being used for blatantly political purposes, but of course not just politics, because in came the banking interests and the money, and to nation states that don't believe in open capitalism, those would be very dangerous subjects to introduce into their particular countries. Now, thank you very much to the astute viewer that said, well, we've missed something, because The Guardian a few days ago flagged up this lady. She'd also been arrested. And what's the story behind this? Well, the lady's name is Aras Amiri. And this is part of the article. Her detention is the latest in a string of recent arrests involving British dual nationals or Iranians linked with British institutions. Last week it emerged that Abbas Dalat, a professor in Imperial College, London, had been arrested in April by the hardline Revolutionary Guards. Hardline, of course, is dropped in there by The Guardian to make sure that you understand that Iran is the nasty
dictatorship.
The dictatorship.
Yeah.
And we'll just put in a bit more. Before her arrest, Amiri had been living in London for 10 years. She has a residence permit, is studying for a postgraduate degree in philosophy at the Kingston University. Simultaneously, she's been working for the British Council, wrote Amrani. This is a commentator on the case. She's worked on film festivals and cultural exchanges between UK and Iran, and more importantly, some of her activities have been in cooperation with the artistic department of Iran's cultural ministry. So she's doing a postgraduate degree on one hand, but she's also working with the British Council. And of course, we would say, well, what was she actually doing with the British Council? Let's bring in the other gentleman that was mentioned here, Dalat. Here he is, British-Iranian academic. Dalat detained in Iran, British officials say. Now, he is slightly different in as much as he's an open political activist, but he's the founder of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, which described itself as an organisation that opposes sanctions, foreign state interference and military intervention in Iran. I found this quite interesting, Mike, that on one hand you could say, well, he appears to be supporting Iran, but we're now starting to ask questions about who exactly these people are and who they're really working for. But at least he's declared openly as a political activist. So that probably leads us on to the British Council. I encourage people to go and have a look at the website, have a look at the team of trustees and the executives, and ask yourself who these people are, because this gentleman previously worked for the NHS. He's been in Macmillan. Suddenly he's heading up the British Council. But the message of this organisation is that we're just very nice people. We just happen to be a little bit to do a little bit of work with the British government, but really you can trust us. They said about Amiri that she'd not been on a work assignment during her visit to Iran. Trust us, she wasn't working for us. A spokesperson for the British Council said the council was aware that one of our staff has been detained in Iran while making a private family visit. The colleague is an Iranian national. This is a fairly early report, of course. The British Council does not have offices or representatives in Iran. We work remotely to develop long-term people-to-people cultural links with Iran, as we do in 100 other countries.
Would you describe this as some kind of tele-subversion then?
Well, I think we get a clue when we go and have a look at this, because they've got a very big section on transparency. when you follow it through, they do mention our relationship with government. To ensure the greatest value for the UK, the British Council is firmly committed to, quote, strategically aligning its work to the long-term policy priority of the UK government. Well, the UK government at the moment clearly wants to see regime change in Syria and Iran.
Yeah.
So if the British Council is aligning its work to the policy of the British government, clearly they're working to overthrow the current government of Iran, and now we get a slightly different picture about what possibly Miss Ratcliffe was doing in Iran, or she is completely innocent and has been totally duped by the activities of these organisations. So at this point, let's bring in the BBC because we can see this little comment. In 2009, Iran closed the British Council offices in Tehran in reaction to the launch in London of BBC's Persian service, which is, quote, loathed by the Iranian establishment. In June 2009, following unrest in the aftermath of a disputed presidential election, Iran arrested several local staff working for the British Embassy in Tehran. Well, of course, the Iranians are not alone in loathing the BBC. We are also happy to say we loathe much of what the BBC does. But the point here is that the BBC is involved politically. So let's come back to Miss Ratcliffe here. This is a report from the Financial Times. It says Iran media raises campaign against Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. This is some of it. A hardline Iranian news agency has attempted to escalate the judicial case, and it's apparently said that it's shown documents which demonstrate that she was actively involved in a, quote, secret project against the Islamic Republic through various organisations. Now, this is exactly what the British government says it's working to do, which is to overthrow the Islamic Republic. And the British government clearly prepared to use different organisations. She was in the core team of the Iran project in the BBC, a secret high security project which pursued different goals, according to the Iranians. But this doesn't seem to be such a bizarre claim. And the allegation possibly refers to the establishment of the BBC Persian service in 2009, which the Islamic Republic considers a security threat and a, quote, mouthpiece for Iran's opponent inside and outside the country. And at that point, let's bring back BBC Media Action, where we can see exactly what the BBC has been up to in Syria, because here was Julia Harkin boasting that the BBC back in 2004 was working with the people who were trying to overthrow Assad. So I think, Mike, it's becoming quite clear is that the British government is funding NGOs and BBC and other charities to destabilise sovereign nation states. But of course, people are being caught up in this policy. And what can we do? Well, we have to tell more people what the British government and the BBC are really up to.
Well, many of the main, speaking of Syria, many of the mainstream media today bitterly making the point that the Syrian government has regained control of 100% of Damascus. I didn't want to put any of the mainstream media coverage of that up, so I thought I would put the Syrian Arab Army's image that they put on their Facebook page, where they're delightedly saying this is the first sunrise in a free Damascus in 7 years. The BBC had said that the Syrian military has declared that it has taken full control of all areas around the capital Damascus for the first time in 6 years. Damascus and its surroundings are completely secure, according to the Syrian army spokesperson. And the announcement came after troops declared Islamic State militants from the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp and the Hajar al-Aswad district. And they go on to quote the usual suspects like the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights and so on. Well, we can ignore that. I would much prefer to look at a sunrise because that's a much more appropriate image under the circumstances.
Absolutely.
Where are we going from here? Prime Minister's questions now. The main feature of, or the main subject of the UK column's NHS conference just over a week ago was the issue of privatisation of the NHS. Theresa May was asked by that in Prime Minister's questions today. And well, this is what she said.
That the former health minister, now the mayor for Manchester, said the private sector puts its capacity into the NHS for the benefit of NHS patients, which I think most people in this country would celebrate.
So to paraphrase that, Brian, we don't need to worry that piecemeal the NHS is being privatised. In fact, we should celebrate it.
We should celebrate it. Okay. Well, we're going to say that UK Column has now started the process. The conference in Nottingham clearly had an effect because, of course, as we learnt yesterday, there was a counter NHS conference put forward after hours, but same location in Nottingham by the Socialist Party, and the Shadow Minister of Health was going to attend that. So I think we can be quite clear now that as information is coming out from people working within the NHS themselves about the immense damage of the privatisation programme, we're going to start to see this smokescreen from central government. But what an insult to say that people who are making profit on the back of sick or injured people are to be praised for their help in supporting the NHS. If they weren't taking profit, maybe there's a different case, but this is about the taking of profit, the making of profit on people who are sick and vulnerable. I find that pretty outrageous, really, Mike.
Yep, right. Let's move on to the issue of water resources in the UK, because back in November last year, the Environment Agency had announced a change in the rules for farmers who abstract water for use on their land for irrigation or any other purpose, which means that they now require a license to continue doing what they have freely done for generations, forever, really. So for a new abstraction license for a previously exempt abstraction, also known as a new authorisation, farmers have 2 years from the 1st of January 2018 to send in a valid application. They have to complete the application form for a Water Resources Licence Part B to tell the government what they want to use the water for. And it's their responsibility to apply for a licence if and when they need one. Before the application period closes, the Environment Agency may take enforcement action if they don't do that, and that enforcement action might include fixed fines, variable fines. Who knows what might happen, because although there is a document which says what sanctions the Environment Agency can take, they don't specify the scale of those sanctions. But today they've produced a new report called The State of the Environment, Water Resources. And they said this is the first major report on water resources in England, and that it states that climate change and demand from a growing population are the biggest pressures on the availability of water. Without action to increase supply, reduce demand and cut down on wastage, many areas of England could see significant supply deficits by 2050, particularly in the southeast. And they highlight unsustainable levels of water abstraction, leakage from water companies, currently estimated at 3 billion litres per day, and demand from industry and the public as the three issues that need to be tackled. So the report shows that current levels of water abstraction are unsustainable in more than a quarter of groundwaters and 1/5 of rivers, leading to reduced flows which could damage local ecology and wildlife. And they're saying that they've produced a 25-year plan that sets out an ambition to reduce individual water use. On average, at the moment, individuals use 140 litres of water per person per day, and they're going to work with industry to set a personal consumption target. The Environment Agency will work with the government to set this target, and cost-effective measures to meet it is how they describe it now. They've got this policy in one hand, the Environment Agency pushing forward very hard with this at the moment. They're tweeting about it, they're putting lots of pressure on about it, they're imposing new licenses in farming. But in the meantime, government driving ahead with, an industry, fracking, which is going to use and deplete freshwater supplies in a way that we haven't seen before. And the key point about this is that once the fresh water has been mixed with the fracking chemicals and the sand and so on, that water cannot be reused. It can't be put back into the fresh water supply. It can't be cleaned. So it has to be disposed of. And so, this seems to be a bit of a disparity in government policy here. Or is this the case that what this report is intending to do is to make sure that us as individuals reduce our water consumption to levels that allow the fracking industry to develop in this country?
Well, it could well be, Mike, but the minimum you could say is a free resource. Water has now become a profit-making resource. So the scarcer you make it, presumably the more profit you can make off the back of that. Yeah. Maybe one way of looking at it.
Absolutely. So on Monday, we reported this new report from the Green Paper from the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, Moscow's Gold, Russian corruption in the UK. And we were making the point that the Foreign Affairs Committee really concerned about so-called dirty money coming in from Russia to this country. The scale of damage that this dirty money can do to UK foreign policy interests dwarfs the benefit of Russian transactions in the city. Now, we commented on this, and many others commented on this. Why are they interested in this right now when dirty money has been coming in from many parts of the world to the City of London for centuries? And really, we haven't been too concerned about it. We have, in fact, made use of it as much as we possibly can over the centuries. Well, another day and another similar situation, because we have an MP, Ben Wallace, who's really concerned about the level of consumption of cocaine in Europe. And he is particularly concerned that Britain is becoming the cocaine capital of the world.
I thought Westminster was the cocaine capital, Mike.
That is absolutely true, as we will shall now remind everybody, of course. But yet again, we have an MP, or an MP in this case, coming out and saying that he's suddenly extremely concerned about the levels of cocaine use in the UK, when, as you rightly point out, London has been, and particularly the Houses of Parliament, have been the capital of cocaine use for many, many years. This is the Daily Star, the Houses of Parliament, MPs caught up in cocaine scandal.
Yeah. Well, I think we've even seen one or two senior MPs sitting in the debate at Westminster, clearly affected by some sort of substance. We better not mention the names, but I seem to remember that film clip with an individual clearly high.
Yes, so that's how it seemed.
Or drunk, I suppose he might have been.
We often ask, what are they on? I think we know now, don't we? Anyway, let's bring Jeremy Wright onto the programme now, because Jeremy Wright, who is of course the in charge of justice in this country, he was speaking at the Chatham House yesterday. He said, "I'm particularly pleased to be speaking here at Chatham House Royal Institute for International Affairs, which has a long-standing record of engaging governments, the private sector and civil society in debate about the most significant and pressing developments in international affairs." So again, let's frame this in terms of, once again, this new merger of government, private sector, third sector, all together, getting together. And what are they getting together to deal with now? The internet. So he said that the truth is, as authors and subjects of international law, nation states have a responsibility here, a responsibility to be clear about how our international law obligations bind us, a responsibility we fulfill through our treaty obligations, our actions and our practice, as well as through our public statements, and a responsibility, I believe, that extends to cyberspace. The very pervasiveness of cyber makes silence from states on the boundaries of acceptable behaviour in cyberspace unsustainable. If we stay silent, if we accept that the challenges posed by cyber technology are too great for the existing framework of international law to bear, that cyberspace will always be a grey area, a piece of blurred boundaries. Then we should expect cyberspace to continue to become a more dangerous place. So he goes on, cyberspace are not and must not be a lawless world. And this is basically where he's going with this. Britain apparently is going to take the lead in turning cyberspace from this lawless world into a place of international law. And we're going to lead that, which I find staggering, because we have utterly failed to lead the world in terms of international law for quite some time now, if ever. And he went on to say that, for example, the WannaCry ransomware attack affected 150 countries, including 48 National Health Service trusts in the United Kingdom. It was one of the most significant attacks to hit the UK in terms of scale and disruption. And he had said that international law rules of attribution, on the attribution of conduct to a state, are clear, set out in the International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility, and require a state to bear responsibility in international law for its internationally wrongful acts. and also for the acts of individuals acting under its instruction, direction, or control. So WannaCry, Britain and US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Denmark, and Japan all reckon that WannaCry was caused by North Korea. No evidence for that, but they did follow the international law rules on attribution of conduct, so that's okay. In other words, they made it up as they go along, right? And then he said that additionally, our attribution, together with 11 other countries of the destructive NotPetya cyber attack against Ukraine to the Russian government, specifically the Russian military in February this year. So that's fine because, again, they used the international law rules on the attribution of conduct, so we don't need to worry about that. And he ended up by saying cyberspace is getting larger, not smaller. Its influence on international relations is growing, not shrinking. So it's ever more important and part of the UK's role in global leadership to do what we can to ensure that the law applies to cyberspace too.
What all this, I'm smiling here, what all this does for me is that they cannot run this country, they cannot fix the potholes in the road, they can't have a stable organisation, you can't run local councils, you can't look after the NHS, you can't run schools, they can't do any basic thing to support the country, but they are going to change the world and they're going to change cyberspace. I think it's a combination of dementia and drugs, Mike.
I think you're probably right.
That's the best I can come to.
Yes.
What are they going to bring in? Well, we're going to jump to Australia, but you can be sure that this is actually happening in UK at the moment. Several people picked up on this headline: gender-neutral parenting, raising kids with the freedom to be themselves. And basically, this is about Australia, although I'm first of all going to point out that it's a bit naughty by Zero Hedge because they say this is Australia, but it's to do with Melbourne Council. And their local city council has announced plans to, quote, audit children's books and toys with a plan to ban them from kindergarten, schools and libraries if they don't meet strict gender guidelines. So this is happening in UK already. We know that books are being removed out of libraries. So don't think that this is something which is a little bit too wacky to believe. This stuff is happening in UK and has been happening for several years. But let's follow this one through. The research suggests that educators should minimise the extent to which gender is labelled and avoid telling children what girls and boys should do. So this is all an attack on sexual identity. You're born as a girl or you're born as a boy. We'll just add this. This is ridiculous. This was the comment in the article, and there was comment from a number of parents who were very angry, but they used the word ridiculous. Well, I'm going to say, no, this is not ridiculous. This is deliberate and calculated policy, and people need to understand this. And then the question for us all is, who created the policy? Where does this come from? If the same policy is appearing in Australia as appearing in UK, then is this a Commonwealth policy, or has this come from another direction? United Nations is always a good one. But it gets worse, because if we look into this article, we can also come up with this one, which is from ABC News, but The Independent has also put this out, where an expert says that parents should ask their baby's permission before changing the dirty nappy. Okay, you with that one, Mike?
Oh, yes.
Right, now if anybody wants to actually have a look at the video clip, there's the address, so you can freeze the screen and have a look at that. This is what the expert said in simple terms. She said, we're involved with parents from birth, just about how to set up a culture of consent in their homes. So I'm going to change a nappy now, is that okay? Of course, the baby's not going to respond to that question with, yes, mum, that's awesome, I'd love to have my nappy changed. But the expert says, if you wait to leave space and wait for body language and eye contact, then you're letting that child know that their response matters.
Yes.
Okay, so I thought we'd do a little bit of analysis on this. This is the culture of consent. This is what the lady is pushing, the expert. So what we've got, first of all, is that it's allowing the state to interfere from birth, as is the case with the named person scheme in Scotland. It starts the sexualization of the child from birth, because the subliminal teaching is that any touching, even if it's your own parents, has a sexual component and thus requires your permission, baby. It breaks down parental authority, as the refamed child will be able to question their parents on the whole consent issue. You want me to do X, Y, and Z, I don't consent. It blurs and breaks down the biological gender identity for male and female, and that is clearly part of the drive for transhumanism. And also we've got the censoring of books to ensure that only state-approved content can be read. And I've stressed again here that UK libraries are already doing this on the basis of political correctness. So what was the response? Well, the local council there says, no, Thomas the Tank Engine won't be banned under the Melbourne Council gender guidelines. They've assured parents that they'll still be able to enjoy their favourite stories in the library amid, quote, outrage over the claims. There we are. Our libraries aim to promote diversity. None of the books mentioned in media reports have been banned. But if we follow it through, the deception is we're not banning books. The reality is that we're moving to censor books to facilitate the real policy, which is diversity reframing of children. So I found this one particularly dark and sinister, but the point is it's happening in Australia, it's also happening in UK. And as we've often said, that if you are part of the gay agenda and you think that the overall government policy is to help support the gays, then of course it isn't, because the ultimate goal is the replacement of any sexual identity through transhumanism. So we'd encourage anybody and everybody to be having a look at that subject. Credible, Mike, Britain in 2018, but also policy in other parts of the world, globalist policy.
Indeed.
Right. Well, we're just going to end on the sad note that today is the funeral for Tina Hurst. Tina was the wife of John Hurst. John has given great service to the British Constitution Group over many years, giving excellent talks as a former policeman on the subject of law and order. And of course, Tina, a campaigner in her own right, and giving John immense support in his work. So we'd just like to send our condolences today to John and his family, and hope that it goes as well as these things can. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.